It was a Tuesday, but not the kind you remember. The sort of dull, colorless day that blends into the rest, easily forgotten by week's end. The sky hung low, a sodden ceiling of gray that pressed down over Rochester. Not the one in New York, but the smaller, sleepier Rochester tucked away in the UK. The streets were slick from a morning drizzle, and the air carried the heavy scent of impending rain. Something in me broke that morning, though I couldn't say what. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the grime on the windows, smudging the world outside into a blur of gray tones. Maybe it was the way the silence inside the house stretched thin, like a thread about to snap. Whatever it was, I snapped first. I yanked the ladder from the garage, filled a bucket with hot, soapy water, and decided, once and for all, to clean those damn windows. No one else in the house cared. They had practically become part of the architecture, streaked, dusty panes that filtered daylight like stained glass made of neglect. I was halfway up the ladder, sponge in hand, the bucket swaying precariously below, when my phone rang. Naturally, it was shoved into the pocket of my jacket, already slipping off my shoulder. Reflexively, stupidly, I reached for it. I don't remember the fall so much as the landing. A bright flash of white-hot pain shot through my left arm as the ground came up to meet me. My vision spun, the overcast sky whirling above me in a carousel of clouds. My phone landed face up beside me, ringing on with mechanical indifference as I lay crumpled on the garden path. The next thing I knew, I was inside an ambulance, cradling my arm and trying not to breathe too sharply. The paramedic kept talking, a soothing blur of words I barely registered. When we pulled up outside Rochester General Hospital, I felt a strange wave of resistance rise inside me. I'd driven past the place hundreds of times, always unsettled by its harsh, brutalist design, its concrete facade, like something out of a dystopian novel. It looked less like a hospital and more like a relic of a future that never came. Inside, it felt no less forgotten. The automatic doors groaned as they opened, dragging themselves apart like they resented the effort. The scent hit me first. That sterile, plastic-tinged stench of bleach, old metal, and something older still. Something like mildew and memory. The linoleum beneath the stretcher was cracked in places, yellowed around the edges, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed with an intermittent flicker, casting sickly halos in the corners of the ceiling. I was wheeled into radiology, x-rayed, and left waiting. Hours passed in a fog of pain and paperwork. My wrist had fractured on impact, and after a tense, painful setting of the bone, they told me I'd be staying overnight for observation. They gave me a private room on the 3rd floor. Lucky, the nurse said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The room was small, with a flickering television suspended from the ceiling like a surveillance camera, and a bed that protested every shift of my weight. The TV was already on when they wheeled me in. Some low-budget local news, replaying in a loop for an empty audience. I fumbled with the remote, silenced the noise, and sank back into the bed, exhausted. Darkness had already fallen outside, the room dim, but not quite dark. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would take me, but that's when I heard it. A baby crying. At first I thought it was the television. Maybe I hadn't turned it off completely, but no. The sound was too real, too raw. It wasn't constant. It would rise up gently, like mist from water, then fade out again. The crying had a strange quality to it, distant and muffled, as though the walls themselves were soaked in sound. It came in waves. Closer, then further, closer again, like someone walking the halls with a child in their arms. Then came the voice, software, almost inaudible, a woman's voice, cooing gently. Shh, the kind of soothing hush meant to lull a baby to sleep. But there was something off about it. The tone was too flat, too rehearsed, like a performance that had gone on far too long. I pressed the call button, fumbling awkwardly with my one good hand. A few minutes later, a nurse entered, looking as tired as I felt. Her green scrubs were wrinkled, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. "Sorry," I said. I think someone brought a baby onto the floor?" She gave me a puzzled look. "No babies on this floor, love. Third floor's all recovery and orthopedic. You must be hearing something from another ward." She offered a kind smile and said she'd check anyway, more to ease my mind than out of any real concern. She left. The crying returned before her footsteps had even faded. This time it was louder, closer. I felt a chill rise along my spine. The air in the room suddenly seemed colder. I pulled the thin blanket up over my chest and stared at the ceiling, too afraid to move, too alert to sleep. When she returned, the nurse looked uneasy. "I checked the hallway and the rooms nearby," she said. "Didn't find anything." "You're sure?" I asked. "Echoes," she said. "These old buildings play tricks on you." She turned off the lights and left me in the dark. I kept the TV on that night, just for the noise. I didn't hear the crying again, and 2 days later, I was discharged. Years passed. The memory faded, filed away in that drawer of odd, unexplained moments we all have, until my niece's birthday party. My sister-in-law, Emma, had just transferred to Rochester General. She was a nurse, too, part of the float staff. When I asked her how she liked it, she hesitated. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not sure I'll stay." "Why not?" She looked around the room, as if checking for someone listening in, then leaned closer. "That place just feels wrong." I raised an eyebrow. "Like haunted wrong," I joked. She laughed nervously, sipping her drink. "You joke, but..." She trailed off. "There's this story. They call her the Shush Woman." The air around us seemed to shift. "She was a patient years ago. Severe postpartum depression, liver issues too, maybe cirrhosis. Smothered her baby, then took her own life. Third floor." I didn't say anything. My hands had gone cold. "They say you can still hear her at night, the baby crying, and her trying to hush it. Staff have heard it. Patients too." I took a long breath. "Which room are you usually assigned to?" She pulled out her phone and tapped through the hospital's schedule. "Room 312, she said, "the room I stayed in." I didn't say another word about it that night, but every time I pass that hospital now, a shiver runs down my spine. I swear sometimes I see movement behind the darkened windows. Not people, not shadows, just movement, like the place itself is alive, watching me, remembering. I still don't know what I heard that night, but I know I didn't imagine it. Others have heard it too, and part of me wishes I never knew the story at all, because now I can't forget it. Not ever. A few years ago, I landed a job at a small, rural hospital just outside of town. Fresh out of school and eager to begin my career, I was over the moon when I got the offer. It wasn't a full-time position, just casual shifts, but the pay was great, and the hospital was familiar to me, since I had completed my final training rotation there. It felt like a perfect starting point, Most of my shifts ran from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., but every now and then I'd be scheduled for a later shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. I didn't love the late shift, especially since the drive back home took nearly an hour, but I told myself it was temporary, a stepping stone, a way to prove myself. Our hospital was small, tiny, actually. On any given evening, there were only 4 nurses working, 1 administrator, myself, and an emergency doctor on call. That's it. Despite the size, or maybe because of it, we got our fair share of unusual cases. Some people couldn't make the longer drive into the city when they were in distress, so we'd occasionally see serious trauma cases come through our doors. The emergency helicopter made landings from time to time, especially when patients needed urgent transportation to a larger facility. I've witnessed some truly heart-wrenching things during my time there. Devastating car accidents on winding country roads, children in critical condition, even desperate folks bringing in injured pets because the nearest veterinarian was closed. Working in a rural hospital isn't for the faint of heart, but nothing compares to what happened on one particular summer night. It was just after 10 p.m., and I was sitting behind the front desk, casually chatting with one of the nurses about a patient's chart. The night had been unusually quiet. We had only admitted 6 patients all evening, and things seemed to be winding down. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above us, and the only sounds were the occasional beeps from the monitoring equipment and the distant ticking of the wall clock. Then I heard something, an odd, metallic scraping noise, coming from the front entrance. I turned my head toward the glass doors, and that's when I saw him. A man was walking toward us slowly, almost deliberately. At first glance, there was nothing especially alarming about him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a long trench coat. That struck me as strange. It was the middle of July, and even though it was nighttime, the air outside was still thick with humidity. There was no need for a coat. The nurse beside me let out a quiet sigh and excused herself to the restroom, leaving me to greet the man on my own. As he drew closer, the scraping sound grew louder, sharper. Something was dragging along the floor behind him. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. But the lighting in the entranceway cast shadows in all the wrong places. The only thing I could tell for sure was that it was metal. The man approached the front desk and stopped directly in front of me. That's when I got a good look at his face. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, and his pupils were wide, nearly swallowing the whites of his eyes. He looked disheveled, as if he hadn't slept in days. His hands were trembling, and he kept running them through his greasy hair, pulling at the strands while grinding his teeth. I recognized the signs immediately. I'd seen it before. He was under the influence of something. Hard drugs, most likely. When people like that show up at hospitals, they're often looking for narcotics. They'll complain of migraines, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, anything difficult to verify or disprove. It's an unfortunate reality of working in healthcare. Trying to stay calm, I began the intake process. As I asked him questions, I noticed he was growing increasingly agitated. His tone became sharp, his body language tense. Still, I maintained my professional demeanor and completed the paperwork as quickly as I could. Once finished, I pointed toward the waiting area and told him the doctor would be with him shortly, about 30 minutes, as the physician had stepped out for a brief break. That was the moment everything changed. his expression twisted into something dark, something violent. Without another word, he stormed off toward the waiting room, and as he turned, the light from the hallway caught the object he was dragging. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was an axe. I froze, my mind racing. For a second, I debated whether to announce a code over the hospital PA system, but something told me that would tip him off and escalate the situation even further. Instead, I silently reached for my phone and dialed the local police. Our town was too small to have its own dedicated force at night, so the nearest patrol would be coming from 2 towns over, at least a 20-minute wait, if not longer. I quickly and quietly moved down the hallway, signaling to the other nurses that we had a serious problem. We were all young women, none of us particularly tall or strong. If it came down to a confrontation, we wouldn't stand a chance against him. I returned to the front desk, trying to appear composed, and paged the on-call doctor, requesting he call me. Minutes passed. No response. Meanwhile, the man in the waiting room was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. Suddenly, he began shouting, crying out for help in a voice so loud and shrill it echoed down the halls. The nurses and I huddled together, watching from a safe distance. We needed to act fast. We came up with a desperate plan. Lock him inside the waiting room. The doors were reinforced with security glass and heavy enough to potentially hold him off until police arrived. Once he stepped into the room again, one of the nurses quickly activated the lock, while another quietly secured the secondary door from the inside. For a brief moment, it seemed like we had succeeded. Then he realized what we had done. The screaming started almost immediately. He flipped over chairs, smashed a lamp, and began hacking at the door with his axe. The sound was deafening, metal on metal, glass shuddering with each impact. Every blow brought him closer to breaking through. We watched in horror as the door's surface began to dent and crack. That's when the doctor finally returned. He came strolling through the front entrance, drink in hand, pausing mid-step when he saw the panic on our faces and heard the chaos coming from the waiting room. Without hesitation, he sprang into action. After we quickly explained the situation, he nodded and disappeared through the back corridor, an area typically used by EMTs for patient drop-offs. The next thing we knew, he had unlocked one of the side entrances to the waiting room, quietly sneaked up behind the man, and tackled him to the ground. The axe clattered across the floor as the doctor wrestled the man's arms behind his back and secured them with cable ties. He then pinned him to the floor and stayed there, keeping him subdued until the police arrived. When the officers finally did show up, they took the man into custody without incident. None of us slept that night. Not really. We stayed behind long after our shift ended, filing reports and giving statements. But the adrenaline wouldn't wear off for days. I'll never forget how calm the doctor was during the entire ordeal. His quick thinking likely saved all of us from serious harm, or worse. From that night on, whenever our schedules overlapped, I made a point to buy him coffee. It was a small gesture, but I didn't know how else to thank him for what he did. That wasn't the first odd incident I'd experienced on the late shift, but it was, without a doubt, the most terrifying. After that night, I decided I'd had enough of late evenings and near-empty hospital corridors. I requested a transfer to the day shift. Fortunately, my request was approved, and I've been working a steady Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, schedule ever since. I feel safer now, surrounded by the hum of daily activity and the comforting presence of the full staff. But every time I hear a scraping sound or see someone in a long coat, a chill runs down my spine, and I remember that night when everything almost went horribly, horribly wrong. Last August, I was admitted to the voluntary psychiatric ward at my local hospital due to some intense struggles with anxiety and depression. It was my second stay, and this time I was told I'd have a roommate. Apparently, when they built the unit, they decided to include double rooms for some reason, probably to maximize space. As a result, patients who were considered stable enough were often paired up. Since I had been there a month earlier, many of the nurses still remembered me. Most people only stay in the unit for about a week or two. It's not the kind of ward that houses people who are actively psychotic or dangerous. That's why I didn't worry too much about having a roommate. Her name was Jane. She seemed polite and quiet, a small, reserved woman who appeared to spend nearly all her time seated at her desk doing crossword puzzles. Each patient had their own small desk and dresser, both positioned next to each other in the room. I was admitted around 6 o'clock in the evening. By 9:30, I had taken my medication and was lying in bed doing a breathing exercise while staring at a calming picture of a tree and fence mounted on the wall. I was trying to settle my mind when I noticed something I hadn't before. There was writing on the picture, subtle but unmistakably there, etched in pencil deep enough to leave indentations. It read, "They are all liars. Liars." Some of it was smudged or unreadable, but the message made my stomach drop. Still, I assumed it was left by a previous patient and decided to let the nurses know. Time moves slowly in psych wards. If you've ever been in one, you know how mind-numbing the days can get. I spent a lot of time pacing the unit. Some patients counted their laps. 30, apparently, equals a mile. I also joined the art group in the activity room, trying to pass the hours with painting. I began noticing something strange. Jane never joined any groups. She never even left the room. Every time I came in, there she was, perched at the desk with that same crossword puzzle in front of her. What started to bother me was that the puzzle never changed. No progress, no signs of movement. It reminded me of that scene in The Shining, where Jack's wife finds out he's typed the same line over and over. Creepy and unsettling. I'd still try to talk to her, say hello, ask how she was, but she slowly stopped responding altogether. The second night, I returned to our room around 10:30. She was still at the desk, that puzzle in front of her, the lights still on. I said goodnight, drew my privacy curtain, and laid down. The medication I was on usually knocked me out quickly, and that night was no different. Around 2 a.m., I was stirred awake. One of the medical assistants was gently asking Jane if she could turn the lights off so I could sleep. Jane said nothing. She just sat there. Eventually, the lights went out and the room went dark. I drifted back to sleep. Later, I woke again. My eyes adjusted, and I realized Jane was whispering something over and over. "Jessie, help me. Jessie, help me." I asked if she was okay, but she didn't respond. She just kept repeating it, almost like a chant. I assumed she might be sleep-talking and tried to go back to sleep, but it kept happening. Louder now. "Jessie, help me. I need help." This time, I got up and found the night nurse, whose name coincidentally was Jessie. I told her Jane had been calling her name. When we returned, Jane was frantic, crying out for Jessie, trying to climb out of bed. The nurse tried calming her down. I was shaken, so they gave me an extra sedative to help me sleep. When I woke up, Jane was gone. Her table had been moved in front of the bathroom curtain. There were no doors due to safety concerns. I went to use the bathroom and found the entire roll of toilet paper stuffed into the toilet. Again, I went to the nurses, not wanting to be blamed for flooding the place. I'd already had an incident with the bathroom on my first day. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed two things. A medical assistant was posted by the main door, and Jane was standing next to her, unmoving. The doors to the unit only open when buzzed by staff. It was odd. Why did she need to be watched? Another patient told me Jane had spent the night running around the ward, tossing furniture around. Eventually, they had to call in security. She calmed down, but then planted herself by the door and stood like a statue for hours. Trying not to overthink it, I went about my morning. Breakfast, painting. Around 10:30, I noticed Jane was back, standing outside the art room window, staring in. She didn't look away for at least 20 minutes, and when she did, she just stayed there. I felt watched. I returned to my room, and for the first time that day, she followed me in. I pretended to be grabbing something and left again. I went straight to the front desk and told one of the assistants, "This might sound paranoid, but I think my roommate is following me." She let me stay near her. I sat down with nothing to do, so I decided to call my insurance company with a question. That's when Jane walked up, holding two plastic bins. Each patient gets a bin with toiletries and supplies when admitted. These were full of her things, and mine. She'd taken my pillowcase and stuffed it with my clothes. She had my iPad. I broke down. The nurses nearby were stunned. None of them had seen anything like this. As I sobbed, someone knelt beside me and said, "It's okay. You're safe." I thought it was one of the nurses until I opened my eyes. It was Jane. She was comforting me. I pushed her away and begged the nurses to keep her away from me. They brought me into a private room to go through my belongings. They told me Jane was being transferred to the involuntary unit. Until then, I wouldn't be allowed back into my room for safety reasons. While they arranged her transfer, she moved to the back exit, the one leading to the garden stairs. She couldn't open it, but she just stood there, watching. Later, my husband came to visit. We sat in the cafeteria, playing cards with a new patient. Jane stood by the window that looked into the cafeteria, staring at me through the glass. Eventually, the psychiatrist arrived with security. They told her it was time to move upstairs. She refused. When a guard touched her arm, she snapped, screaming, banging on the glass, yelling my name, demanding I help her. They had to drag her away. After that, I was assigned a new roommate, also named Jane, oddly enough. But this Jane was kind and soft-spoken, just there to detox from a medication. My psychiatrist reassured me that my response to everything had been completely reasonable. The next day, during garden time, I was alarmed to see the first Jane among the upstairs patients. I asked if I could sit near the staff, and they agreed. She didn't approach me, but I could feel her eyes. When we went back inside, I intentionally separated myself from the group. Despite that, Jane suddenly rushed toward me. The staff had to restrain her again. That was the last time I saw her. I don't know what it was about me that triggered something in her. I hate to imagine what might have happened if I hadn't spoken up when I did. The hospital that wasn't working in healthcare sales means I spend most of my time in and out of hospitals, speaking with doctors, nurses, and department heads. My job is to educate medical staff on how our product works, demonstrate its benefits, and answer any questions they might have. I move from one hospital to the next, getting face time with various teams and helping them understand how our product can improve care for their patients. It's a role that blends people skills, technical know how, and a lot of persistence. And honestly, I really like it. Every day is a little different. New faces, new conversations. Since I moved for this job, I've taken the opportunity to explore different parts of the state, using hospital visits as an excuse to get to know my surroundings. It helps the days feel less repetitive. On this particular morning, I had no scheduled product demos or meetings, no training sessions on the calendar. So I decided it would be a good time to visit a hospital I hadn't yet introduced myself to, located a few towns over. I figured if I brought along a box of fresh coffee and some baked goods, I could break the ice with the staff and hopefully book a time to present our product in more detail. I'd never been to that part of the state before, so I turned on some music, set my GPS, and made the drive. It was a sunny, late morning, and the closer I got, the more I felt like I was driving into an area untouched by time. The roads narrowed, the neighborhoods thinned out, and the trees became taller and more clustered. But then I saw it, sitting just off the main road, partially hidden behind a wall of pines. The hospital. It was massive, easily the biggest facility I had seen in that region. The exterior was sleek and modern, all clean lines and glass. The landscaping was immaculate. Trimmed hedges, rows of flowers in full bloom, and freshly mowed grass. From the outside, it looked like a facility at the top of its game, bustling, organized, and up to date. The parking lot was completely full, which struck me as a good sign. It meant the hospital was busy, active. I was about to turn around when I noticed a single open spot right near the main entrance. I pulled in, grabbed the box of coffee and bag of pastries, and made my way toward the front doors. That's when things started to feel off. The sliding glass doors didn't open automatically. Instead, a faded sign instructed visitors to press a buzzer and state the name of the doctor or patient they were visiting. That wasn't too unusual. Many hospitals had tightened security since the pandemic. Still, it felt strange that the entrance was so quiet, even with a full parking lot. I pressed the buzzer and waited. A mechanical click sounded from the door, and the glass panels slid open, revealing a cool, dimly lit lobby. I stepped inside and immediately froze. The room was empty. Not just quiet, empty. The reception area was eerily still. There were no patients, no visitors, no staff. Several wheelchairs sat scattered throughout the lobby, some tipped over, as if someone had abandoned them in a rush. The chairs in the waiting area had faded upholstery and sun-bleached cushions, mismatched with the high-end exterior. The carpet was worn and stained in places, and the lighting overhead flickered faintly. I glanced around, expecting someone to appear from a hallway or through one of the frosted glass doors that led deeper into the hospital. But no one came. I slowly made my way to the front desk. It, too, was deserted. No computer, no pens, not even a sticky note or a stray coffee cup, just a dust-covered rotary phone sitting squarely in the middle. A real old-school rotary phone. I'm 28 years old, and I'm pretty sure that was the first time I'd ever seen one in real life, let alone used it. There was a yellowing piece of paper taped to the desk. Dial 0 for operator. The handwriting was loopy and faded, as if it had been there for decades. I picked up the receiver. No dial tone, just silence. I hung it up, then tried again. Still nothing. The line was completely dead. A cold feeling crept down my spine. The place had the exterior of a bustling hospital, but the inside of a long-forgotten building. Still, I was trying to remain professional, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they had temporarily shut down the main lobby. Maybe I came in through the wrong door. Maybe, but I couldn't shake the unease. I set the coffee and pastries on the front desk and walked down the adjoining hallway. To my left, the corridor was completely dark. The ceiling light was either broken or turned off. No emergency lighting, no backlit signs, no glowing exit indicators, just pitch black. To my right, another hallway led to a set of cloudy glass doors, but they were closed and didn't budge when I tried the handle. No matter where I turned, there were no voices, no machines beeping, no hospital smells, no antiseptic or cafeteria food or latex gloves, just nothing. The only sounds were the soft creaks of the building settling and the hum of fluorescent lights in the distance. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fill the air, it presses in around you. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I looked back at the box of coffee and my branded folders, feeling ridiculous. I was hoping to connect with potential clients, and instead, I was wandering through what felt like a ghost hospital. Finally, I picked everything back up and turned to leave. As I walked through the empty lobby again, I took a second look at the wheelchairs. There were 7 of them, scattered around in strange positions. It almost looked staged, like the aftermath of a fire drill that no one returned from. When the front doors slid open behind me and I stepped into the warm sunlight, the sense of dread lifted almost immediately. It was as though I had walked out of a dream, one of those unsettling, liminal dreams where everything looks almost right, but nothing feels right. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, staring back at the building. Then I got in my car, drove around to the other side of the hospital, and looked for another entrance. There was one back door, but it was locked and looked long unused. No signs, no deliveries, no staff. Finally, I pulled over and called a coworker, the one who'd previously managed this territory before me. I described the building and told them I'd stopped by to introduce myself and drop off some materials. But the place seemed abandoned. They paused. "I've been there lots of times," they said. "That hospital is always busy. The lobby's huge, usually packed. TVs on the wall, a couple of receptionists. Definitely not how you're describing it." I told them about the rotary phone, the deadline, the silent hallways. "That doesn't make sense," they replied. "The place is fully operational." I hung up, deeply confused. I checked the hospital's website. It was active. The Google listing showed it as open now. And yet, I had just walked through an empty shell. I haven't been able to explain what happened that day. Maybe I walked into the wrong building. Maybe there's an old, unused wing I somehow entered by mistake. But none of that explains the locked front doors that buzzed me in, or the polished gardens outside contrasting the decaying interior or the complete and total absence of another living soul. I've been to dozens of hospitals since then, big and small, new and old, and none have ever felt like that place. I haven't gone back. I'm not sure I could bring myself to. Because here's the thing. In all my time working in healthcare, I've learned that even the quietest hospitals never sound like that. There's always something. A cough, a conversation, the ding of an elevator, the clatter of wheels down a hallway. But that building had nothing, and I don't think I was supposed to be there. I've worked in a variety of hospitals and care facilities over the years, but before landing my current job, I spent some time at a geriatric hospital about half an hour from home. I already had experience working with elderly patients, so I felt well prepared. I had only been at this hospital for a few weeks, and you'll soon understand why my time there was so short. This particular story happened during my second to last shift, though I had no idea that night would be so unforgettable. I was working the overnight shift, completely exhausted from a long string of back-to-back days and barely any sleep. That night, I was assigned to the Alzheimer's unit. The residents there took a real liking to me. As a young woman in my 20s, I imagine I was a bit of a spark in an otherwise slow, repetitive world. For people drifting in and out of memories, my presence seemed to ground them, something or someone tethered to the present moment. Being around someone else, even briefly, can bring clarity to the fog. I had several patients to look after, but one in particular stood out that night. Her name was Lena. It was my first time attending to her, and she seemed more agitated than most. Each time I entered her room, she whispered to me about voices she claimed to hear, and about a man in black she swore was watching her from the corner. Her roommate, an older woman who smiled sweetly at me, but rarely spoke, had asked earlier in the evening that I keep the curtain drawn between their beds, likely to avoid Lena's disturbances. By 11 p.m., nearly all the patients had settled down for the night, except for Lena. She called me into the room multiple times, her face filled with fear, always talking about the voices and the figure in the corner. I'll admit, it started to unnerve me. I believed she was genuinely seeing and hearing these things, and I could only imagine how terrifying that must feel. I tried my best to soothe her, to help her feel safe enough to rest. I didn't want to turn the TV on since her roommate was asleep, so I simply held her hand and spoke softly, reminding her she wasn't alone, that I was right down the hall if she needed me. After a while, she relaxed. When I came back later to check on her, she was finally asleep. When the ward gets quiet like that in the middle of the night, time seems to crawl. Every second stretches out. A couple hours later, I was in the linen room, restocking my cart. The room was small and silent, and I had shut the door behind me. That's why it struck me as strange when I suddenly heard a sound, a noise that shouldn't have been there. I turned but saw nothing, brushed it off, went back to stacking sheets. Then I felt it, a hand, a firm pressure on my shoulder. It was so real that I instantly spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Nothing. The room was empty. My shoulder still tingled where the touch had been. I peeked out into the hallway. No staff around. Everything was eerily still. I shook it off, tried to convince myself I was just overtired, and continued loading up the cart. But when I turned back toward the door, I dropped everything and hit the floor screaming. A man, dressed entirely in black, was standing just beyond the glass window of the door, staring at me, grinning. I screamed so loudly, it roused nearly the entire unit. In the blink of an eye, the man moved out of view, vanishing from the doorway. Seconds later, another nurse burst in, alarmed by my screams, and helped me to my feet. I asked her if she'd seen the man. She looked confused. "What man?" she asked. "There's no one else here." We searched the entire unit. Nothing. No sign of anyone dressed in black. Lena had woken up during the commotion. When I walked into her room, she immediately started talking about the voices again. And this time, the screams. She had no idea they'd come from me. I asked her about the man she kept seeing. Was he smiling? I asked. Her expression changed. It was the most alert I'd seen her all night. Her brows furrowed and she stared at me, asking, "How did you know?" My heart skipped a beat. And then she started screaming for help, yelling that he was coming. Other nurses rushed in to calm her down. That was the final straw. I was reassigned to another ward for the rest of the night and ended up going home early. I was too shaken to stay. The next day, I texted the head nurse and told her that my next shift would be my last. I didn't want to step foot in that hospital again. To her credit, she was understanding. I've never been diagnosed with any mental health conditions. I've never hallucinated before. I know what sleep deprivation can do to the mind, but this felt like something else entirely. That hand on my shoulder, that grinning face at the door, matching the exact description Lena had repeated to me earlier. It still gives me chills. I don't know what I experienced that night, but I hope it's the only time in my life I ever come face to face with something like it. Some things just can't be explained. I once matched with this girl on Tinder named Francesca. We're still friends to this day. She caught my attention right away. She had this edgy look with a full sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, streaks of red in her hair, and a profile that made it clear she was all about fitness. One of her pictures stood out. It was taken on the rooftop of a building with an insane view. I asked her where it was, and she told me it was an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. She said it was super easy to sneak into at night and made for a great spot to explore. Apparently, the place had only one patrol cop watching the massive parking lot, and avoiding him wasn't a big deal. She actually suggested we go there together for what would technically be our first date, though it felt more like an adventure. I was all in. It sounded way more exciting than the usual grab-a-drink plan. I picked her up from her place, which was only about 10 minutes from mine, and then we drove around 20 minutes out to the hospital. The drive gave us a chance to break the ice and get comfortable talking to each other. When we arrived, she directed me to park at the end of a dead-end street, hidden behind some tall bushes. From there, it was a 5-minute walk to the hospital itself. We climbed over a short barrier that separated the road from the hospital grounds and jogged across the open lot toward a patch of grass by the entrance she usually used. She led me to a busted-out window in the basement. It gave me the creeps, but I had signed up for this. Thankfully, I'd followed her advice and wore some old jeans I didn't mind getting torn up. We just used our phone flashlights Nothing fancy. Francesca clearly knew the layout like she'd been there 100 times. She led us to a staircase that brought us up to the first floor. I'll admit, being in that dark, empty hospital with just one other person was pretty nerve-wracking, but I didn't realize how intense things were about to get. Once we were upstairs, Francesca kept talking at full volume, which made me a little anxious. Her voice echoed down the hallway, and I kept glancing around, half expecting someone to appear. Then we both heard it, a door slamming somewhere in the distance. She stopped talking mid-sentence, and I whispered, "Is it normal for other people to be here?" She shrugged and said, "Sometimes, but not usually." We quickly shut off our lights and stood still. That's when we heard another noise, this one much closer, like a loud bang. We panicked and took off in the dark, fumbling our way back to the stairs. We turned our flashlights back on and bolted up a couple more levels, finally slowing down once we felt far enough away. Francesca mentioned that cops never actually go inside, so it could have been other people. But we hadn't seen any other lights, and that was weird. No normal person walks around that place in the dark. Then we heard footsteps echoing from the stairwell we just came from. Someone was definitely following us. We ran again. Francesca said she knew a place we could hide. We sprinted through a series of hallways. It felt like a maze, and I was freaking out. I didn't know if we were being chased by police or something worse. Eventually, she led us to a little outdoor section, not the highest roof, but a rooftop of sorts on that level. We paused there to catch our breath. The whole vibe had shifted from fun and spontaneous to full-on fear. Even Francesca looked uneasy, and she was supposed to be the pro here. After a few minutes, she led us through another broken window into what seemed like the attic or ceiling of a large room. This part was especially sketchy. There were long wooden boards laid out like makeshift bridges, with a 10-foot drop underneath. A fall would have definitely resulted in injuries, but I didn't want to be the guy who chickened out, so I followed her across. We stopped on this pillar, where one plank ended and another began. We sat down with our legs dangling over the edge, just trying to chill and reset. But then we heard footsteps below us. Someone was down there. We turned our lights back on and aimed them downward. Right beneath us, a man, probably in his 40s, was staring up at us. He was wearing a black Carhartt beanie, black jacket, and dark sweatpants. He had this unsettling grin and said in a deep voice, "Come on down," while waving for us to descend. I asked if he was a cop, but he ignored me, just repeated himself, "Come on down." At that point, we were terrified. We slowly got up and started walking back across the plank. But now I was shaking more from fear than the height. I kept glancing down, half expecting him to climb up somehow. He didn't, but he did rush out of the room through a side door. It was clear he was trying to cut us off. We booked it again, heading for the opposite stairwell. As we ran down, we heard the door above us slam open. He was coming down after us. Heavy footsteps pounded from above, closing the gap. We flew down those stairs like our lives depended on it. Back on the first floor, we sprinted across the building to the basement window we came in through. Francesca went out first, and as I climbed through after her, I was bracing myself for the guy to grab my legs from behind. Thankfully, he never showed. We ran all the way back to my car, jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there catching our breath. It was the most terrifying night I'd ever experienced, but somehow, surviving it together created this weird bond between us. We drove off and ended up stopping at a Wendy's to grab some food and to decompress. We sat in the car for about an hour, just talking and letting the adrenaline wear off before I took her home. Francesca and I stayed close for a while. We dated for a few months, but eventually just became good friends. One thing we both agreed on: we were never going back to that hospital again. About 6 years ago, when I was around 14, I used to explore the winding trails that stretched through my parents' vast property. They had recently bought over 100 acres of land, mostly wild fields, thick woods, and quiet streams snaking through the terrain. It was peaceful and untouched, perfect for wandering, and I'd often roam the trails in the late afternoons, just enjoying the silence and solitude. All over the property were old farming tools left behind by whoever had owned the land before us. Some were rusted and half buried in dirt, and there were also a few decaying wooden sheds hidden deep in the trees. These structures looked like they hadn't been used in decades. Doors hanging off the hinges, vines crawling up the sides, roofs sagging into feet. The whole area had a strange, forgotten feeling to it. One particular day, I was walking a narrow path, thick bushes on both sides, when suddenly a golden retriever bolted out of the brush and stopped right in front of me. I paused, confused. We didn't have a dog, and the closest neighbors were miles away. The dog stood there motionless, staring directly at me. Then it barked once, loud and sharp, but instantly froze, mid-step, body tense like something had spooked it. Its eyes locked on me, and its tail stayed still. I had no clue what it wanted or where it came from. Then, not more than a few moments later, a guy, probably about 19 or 20, burst out of the same bushes. He looked around frantically and froze when he spotted me. His expression was a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't place. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he shouted. Then, without warning, he started running toward me. Terrified, I turned and sprinted back toward the house. I didn't stop to look back, but I could hear him yelling behind me, calling for me to wait. What freaked me out most was how familiar his voice sounded, though I couldn't quite figure out why. His tone sent a chill down my spine, like I should know who he was, but couldn't place it. Eventually, as I cut through the forest and got closer to the house, his voice faded, and it didn't sound like he was following me anymore. I didn't slow down until I was safe inside. Breathless and shaking, I told my parents everything. My stepdad even went out to check the area, walking around for nearly an hour, but he didn't find a single trace of anyone or any dog. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. To make things worse, my parents didn't believe me. They were pretty strict and deeply religious, and they brushed it off as just another dramatic story from their rebellious teen. I even got grounded over it, which only added to how helpless and confused I felt. But here's where things take an even stranger turn. About 5 weeks ago, I went back to visit my parents, this time with my girlfriend and her golden retriever Bentley. Everything started off totally normal. We chatted, had some drinks, and caught up. It felt good to be home again, away from the noise of work and day-to-day stress. Later that evening, I stepped outside to let Bentley out and have a smoke. We were just hanging out when, out of nowhere, Bentley took off at full speed into the woods. I yelled for him to stop and immediately ran after him, but he was too fast, and I quickly lost sight of him in the trees. About 5 minutes into searching, I heard Bentley barking in the distance. I rushed toward the sound, and that's when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Just ahead, maybe 15 feet away, stood a kid playing in the woods right next to Bentley. I stared, confused and slightly uneasy. "Hey," I called out, "what are you doing out here?" But as soon as I stepped forward, the kid bolted, sprinting through the bushes and vanishing deeper into the woods. But it wasn't just his sudden disappearance that got to me. It was his clothes. He was wearing the exact same outfit I used to wear when I was 14. The same old hoodie, the same worn jeans. It was like looking at a memory in real time. When I got back to the house, I told my girlfriend what happened. I tried to explain everything: the boy, the clothes, how Bentley led me to him. She looked at me like I was losing my mind. I could tell she didn't really believe me, even though she didn't say it out loud. Still, I know what I saw. And when I think back to that first encounter with the man and the golden retriever years ago, how familiar his voice sounded. It makes my skin crawl. I used to tell myself it was just some strange guy messing around in the woods. But now, I'm starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, that man wasn't a stranger at all. Maybe I was chasing a dog and running from myself.